pull into a highway rest stop at noon in July. It's triple-digit heat. The asphalt is soft. Every single semi-truck in that lot is parked and running. Engines idling, going nowhere, burning diesel in the middle of the hottest afternoon of the year. Your first instinct is probably that this is wasteful, maybe illegal. The driver isn't even moving. The air conditioning is already doing its job. So why does a parked truck need to run its engine when it's already 100 degrees Fahrenheit outside? The obvious answer is air conditioning. The driver wants to stay cool. But that's not actually the reason, or at least it's not close to the whole reason. The real answer involves a federal law you have never read: the thermal physics of a metal box in direct sunlight, a medical device most people forget exists, and a cold chain logistics system that determined whether what you ate for breakfast this morning was safe to eat. And it connects to something you touched today without thinking about it at all. There are at least 4 layers here, and each one is stranger than the last. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why that engine is running, and you'll realize you've been completely surrounded by the consequences of this decision your entire life without ever seeing the system. But let's start with what everyone gets wrong. Everyone's first answer is the same. The driver is hot. The air conditioning needs to run. Makes sense. Turn it off and the driver sweats. Simple. But a parked truck isn't like a parked car. Leave any vehicle in a parking lot on a 90-degree Fahrenheit day with the engine off. Come back in 20 minutes. The interior temperature has already climbed roughly 29 degrees, from 90 degrees Fahrenheit outside to close to 120 degrees Fahrenheit inside. Now consider what happens on a 100-degree Fahrenheit afternoon. 30 minutes after that engine cuts off, a sleeper cab interior can exceed 130 degrees Fahrenheit. And that cab isn't venting. The windows are up. The driver is asleep. Here's the piece most people skip when they think about summer idling. That driver isn't choosing to be in that cab. They are legally required to be there. Under Federal Hours of Service Rules, 49 CFR, Part 395, a long-haul commercial driver must take a mandatory rest period before they can legally operate that vehicle again. The sleeper berth component of that rest has to be at least 7 consecutive hours, with total off-duty time reaching 10 hours. That is not a suggestion. That is federal law. So at noon in July, when that driver parks and kills the engine, the next 10 hours of their life are happening inside that cab, whether they want it or not. And here is where the numbers start to matter. The human body begins showing signs of heat exhaustion when core temperature climbs above 101 degrees Fahrenheit. Heat stroke is defined as core temperature exceeding 104 degrees Fahrenheit, at which point the central nervous system is actively impaired. Above 106 degrees Fahrenheit, organ damage becomes a real and documented risk. A sleeping person in a 130-degree metal box for 10 mandatory hours is not in a comfort problem. They are in a survival problem. They could develop heat stroke during the rest period they are legally required to complete. So the air conditioning is not comfort. It is the only mechanism keeping a federally mandated rest period from becoming a medical emergency. But here's what that explanation misses. Air conditioning is just the surface layer. There's another reason the engine stays on, and a driver who loses access to it for one night is not just groggy the next morning. They are a documented safety hazard on a 40-ton vehicle at highway speed. But the heat isn't even the most important reason the engine stays on. The conventional understanding of summer truck idling goes roughly like this. Hot outside, needs air conditioning, runs engine. That framing treats this as a comfort decision. The biology points somewhere else entirely. Here's what almost no one mentions. Somewhere between 28 and 34% of long-haul commercial truck drivers have been diagnosed with obstructive sleep apnea. That number comes from research funded by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. The general adult population rate sits at around 5%. Truckers run more than 6 times higher, driven by the sedentary nature of long-haul driving, irregular sleep schedules, and documented health trends in the industry, Sleep apnea means the airway partially collapses during sleep. The body interrupts breathing repeatedly through the night. The standard treatment is a CPAP machine, a device that delivers continuous air pressure through a mask, maintaining an open airway from lights out to alarm. Without power, the CPAP machine goes offline. Without the CPAP, the driver spends the night with repeated oxygen interruptions, their brain cycling in and out of proper sleep, their body never reaching the restorative stages it needs. A driver coming off that kind of night is operating at a cognitive level that research has compared to someone who has been awake for 24 hours. Now put that driver behind a 40-ton vehicle at 65 miles per hour. That's not a health inconvenience. That's a rolling safety event. The CPAP running off the idle engine isn't the driver managing a personal medical issue. It's the rest of the highway being protected. But the diesel engine in summer is doing something else that almost nobody expects. Diesel engines use compression ignition. There are no spark plugs. Air is compressed until it is hot enough for the fuel to combust on its own. In winter, cold ambient air makes that process harder. That leads to incomplete combustion and extra wear before the oil circulates. In summer, the warm air is actually an advantage for the engine. A 100-degree afternoon is not fighting the engine's thermodynamics. In summer, the engine runs not because of anything mechanical about the engine's needs. It runs entirely because of the humans, depending on its electrical output. And this connects directly to something in your refrigerator right now. But first, we need to understand why the obvious solution, the one the industry invented specifically for this problem, still is not in most trucks. Because that gap is the thing that explains everything. Here's where it gets genuinely strange. The solution exists. It is called an auxiliary power unit, APU. Think of it as a compact, self-contained generator, roughly the size of a large suitcase, bolted onto the side of the truck frame. It runs the cab's heating and air conditioning, powers the outlets, and keeps the CPAP running through the night without the main engine ever turning over. A diesel APU burns somewhere between 0.3 and 0.5 gallons per hour. The main engine at idle burns between 0.8 and 1 gallon per hour. So the APU is cleaner, quieter, and significantly more fuel efficient. It was engineered specifically to eliminate the idling problem in both summer and winter. But here's the number that changes everything. An APU costs between $8,000 and $12,000 installed. That is a suitcase-sized box that costs as much as a used car. For a large fleet carrier, that is a capital expense they can model, depreciate, and absorb. But the majority of long-haul trucking in this country runs through independent owner-operators, drivers who own their trucks, negotiate their own contracts, and operate on margins that can disappear with a single major repair. For those drivers, $10,000 on an APU is not a cost-benefit calculation. It is a question of whether they keep the truck. Electric APU systems exist, running off battery packs instead of a sub-diesel engine, but they cost $15,000 to $25,000, and in sustained extreme heat, the batteries carry their own thermal management problem. They are fighting the same 100 degrees Fahrenheit ambient air the driver is in. Therefore, the main engine keeps running, not because the driver does not know about the APU, because the gap between the solution existing and the driver being able to afford the solution is still wide enough to run a diesel engine through. But this behavior didn't start with auxiliary power units or the lack of them. Go back to the 1940s and 1950s. Long-haul trucking meant two-lane highways, diners every 50 miles, and drivers sleeping in the seat or paying for a motel. Sleeper berths didn't exist because the runs weren't long enough to need them. Then the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 set off the construction of the interstate highway system. And suddenly, you could drive from Chicago to Los Angeles without stopping for a town. Sleeper cabs started appearing on production trucks in the 1960s to match those longer routes and became standard through the 1970s and 1980s. Cab air conditioning was a rare option through most of that period. In summer, drivers dealt with wet rags, cracked windows, and parking in shade. In winter, fleet mechanics at truck depots would drain the oil out of engines at night, store it warm indoors, and pour it back in before the morning start. That was the actual solution. Running the engine overnight was the upgrade. So by the time cab air conditioning became standard in the 1980s and 1990s, running the engine through the night was already a 30-year-old habit, baked into fleet training, maintenance culture, and the way experienced drivers taught new ones. And here's the problem with habits baked that deep. They outlast the original reason. Better oil technology arrived. Better engine design arrived. Auxiliary power units arrived. The behavior stayed. And now we're about to see where 50 years of that habit lands every single day in your life. Here's the part that should bother you a little. You have been completely surrounded by the downstream effects of this decision your entire life. You just did not have a framework to see it. That strawberry you put in your cereal this morning rode in a refrigerated trailer driven by someone who needed to stay cool enough to complete a mandatory rest period. Somewhere along that route, a driver was parked at a truck stop in the Central Valley at 2 in the morning with the engine running because the ambient low was 88 degrees and the alternative was 10 hours in a 130-degree metal box. That bag of pre-washed salad in your refrigerator, same chain. The insulin at your local pharmacy. The pharmaceutical cold chain in the United States alone exceeds $17 billion annually. And the FDA Food Safety Modernization Act requires documented temperature control at every link. A driver who cannot rest properly or whose CPAP went dark because they cut the engine is a driver who may not complete the route. And a route that does not complete is a cold chain that breaks. The economics of this, scaled up, are staggering. One truck idling for 8 hours at current diesel prices cost the driver roughly $36 in fuel that moved the vehicle exactly 0 miles. Across a fleet of 1,000 trucks, that is $36,000 per night. Over a summer driving season, the numbers reach into the millions, and fleet managers track idle time the same way they track a fuel leak, because functionally that is what it is. The difference is a fuel leak is a malfunction. This one is legally necessary. More than 30 states have anti-idling laws for heavy-duty trucks, but virtually every single one carves out a specific temperature exemption, typically when ambient temperatures exceed 80 degrees Fahrenheit, for exactly the reasons we have been covering. The law recognized what the physics had already established. The no idle signs you have driven past at certain truck stops exist because of that 30-state patchwork. The shore power hookups at major travel centers, outdoor electrical outlets where a driver can plug in like a phone charger, were invented specifically to replace overnight idling. California invested hundreds of millions of dollars in that infrastructure to reduce diesel emissions near freight corridors. All of it. The regulations, the auxiliary power unit market, the shore power pedestals, the fleet GPS systems flagging idle time as a cost metric. Every piece of that infrastructure exists because of the exact problem we have been building through. So here's where you actually land. You pulled into that rest stop at noon in July, thinking you were looking at waste. A driver burning diesel in the middle of a heat wave, going nowhere for no reason anyone had bothered to explain. But what you were actually looking at was a federal mandate requiring 10 hours inside that cab with no override. Thermal physics that can take a 100-degree Fahrenheit afternoon to 130 degrees Fahrenheit inside a closed metal box in 20 minutes. A continuous positive airway pressure machine keeping a documented medical condition from becoming a highway fatality the next morning. A cold chain worth over $100 billion annually, dependent on drivers who can actually rest. A $10,000 auxiliary power unit the driver could not absorb. And a 50-year industry habit still being unwound, one truck stop electrification pedestal at a time. That engine you used to find wasteful on a 100-degree day. That is the sound of the system keeping your food safe, your driver alert, and the supply chain running through the worst heat of the year. And if you think summer cab idling is complicated, Wait until we get into the refrigerated trailer being pulled behind that truck, the one with its own completely separate engine, its own independent fuel tank, and its own set of temperature rules that have absolutely nothing to do with the driver sleeping 40 feet away from it.